TikTok's parent company ByteDance has cracked the code on avoiding a ban in the U.S. The company is signing a deal to spin off its U.S. business. Among the investors are Silver Lake, MGX, and Oracle. Let's bring in Jim Anderson. He's co-founder and CEO of Beacon. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So each of these firms get a 15% stake in ByteDance, but MGX is out of Abu Dhabi. So is there enough of a dispersion of ownership to put American concerns to rest?
Well, you would hope so. I would look partly at the ownership. I'd also look partly at the governance and the board of directors. They have said that the board of directors that is going to control that is going to be American dominated. There's not a lot of specifics there. But interestingly, and I think this was probably important as part of the negotiations between the U.S. and China, ByteDance and its affiliated investors still own more than 50%. It's slightly more than 50% of the company. So you've got sort of a predominantly Chinese and Chinese affiliated ownership and then predominantly American governance, and that strikes me as a compromise, right? That's what they've been hashing out for the past several months.
Okay, so Jim, what does Oracle get out of this?
Well, Oracle gets a stake, and obviously they got a boost in their stock price because there's lots of concerns about their exposure to a few companies, and so obviously this TikTok's one of the most successful commercial applications out there, and to the degree that Oracle is providing a lot of the technology and the cloud computing and just more broadly the compute, that's a good deal for Oracle clearly, and that's what Larry Ellison and Oracle clearly has been interested in for a long time here.
Tell me about Silver Lake.
Silver Lake, it's interesting. I think you have to imagine there was a lot of political connections at work here. I mean, clearly this was got the eyes and the attention of President Trump. He issued repeated executive orders to provide more time against a duly enacted U.S. law, saying that that they were not allowed to do what they were doing, and so he basically put off enforcement of any of that. And you have to believe the people at the table, including Silver Lake, are pretty well connected politically and to those conversations. So there's a lot of sources of money, and I think the sources of money here, came from, as we saw, multiple different places that were all very well connected to President Trump.
Do you think that there were other contenders, and if so, who would they have been?
Yeah, there were many other contenders. Lots of people wanted to get a seat at this table, and Microsoft was probably the biggest name that came up early on. But for whatever reason, probably antitrust and other reasons, that was not a winning play long term. But I'd be willing to bet if you said, okay, who's the list of companies that would have been interested, it would have been easier to compile a list of companies that were not interested. It would be much shorter, because who would not? Any tech company would love to be affiliated with an app the size, scale, and the algorithmic intelligence of something like TikTok.
So do we know if China is on board? I know the deal is expected to be signed sort of end of January. Has Beijing said it's on board with this?
They have not said, at least it's been publicly reported, but the fact that they came up with a January 22nd closing date, right? I mean, it's December 19th, so January 22nd, that's an extraordinarily short window to close. So I think that's a pretty strong signal. I'm having a hard time imagining they would have come out with that as a close date if they didn't already have either tacit approval from the Chinese government or even explicit approval from the Chinese government that's not yet been made public. And again, this has always been a deal between the U.S. and China, right? This is geopolitics, and as big and as successful as TikTok and ByteDance are, they are pawns on the chessboard between the U.S. and China, and I'm sure they're very happy to be in a position where they can be out of that limelight and be off running and growing their business.
My understanding was that, of course, the American information being at risk, they wanted to have an American place to put that information to secure it from being compromised. So if that is now secured, what about the algorithm? Who gets control of that?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually the bigger concern. Everything on the internet is one click away from anywhere in the world, right? So the fact that the data is housed in the U.S., I'm not saying that's not worth anything, but that's really not that big of a win, honestly. I think the far bigger concern has been the algorithm, right? That's what's differentiated TikTok. It's remarkably successful, and that algorithm programmed so that what you see in your TikTok feed, what I see in my TikTok feed are going to be very different because we have different interests, and that's a remarkably effective algorithm. That still is not specified. You have to imagine that ByteDance controls the algorithm sort of holistically, but there are notable statements that the U.S. governance, the board that's going to govern the joint venture, has control over the ability to see that algorithm, to train the algorithm, and ultimately some of the inputs into that algorithm. And again, it's a very messy compromise that's not clear at all, and it's probably not clear to the people who have to make it work as well. But if the alternative is shutting TikTok down in the U.S., which was a real alternative, even a messy outcome is really a big win for the company.
Do you see this model then being used in other countries? See how it rolls out sort of in the U.S. and for the same reason being rolled out in other countries?
Yeah, I think you're going to, it will definitely be a benchmark that other countries who have the same concerns can use, whether they have the same negotiating leverage with China, because ultimately, remember, China has to sign off on every one of these deals, China, the country and the government, not just ByteDance, the Chinese company. So if it's in the Chinese government's interest or perceived interest to sign off on a deal with another jurisdiction, then maybe. But I'd be hesitant to say, oh, this is the new benchmark and it's going to be followed elsewhere. It is a path that has been followed and might work for other countries, but I wouldn't necessarily presuppose that.
All right, Jim Anderson, appreciate you joining us today. Jim is the co-founder and CEO of Beacon.